One Christmas Eve, a small family, Elise, her husband Mark, and their young daughter Lily, decided to spend the holiday in an isolated cabin deep in the woods. They had rented it for a quiet, peaceful getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was snowing heavily, and the world outside seemed like a winter wonderland, untouched by time. They set up their Christmas tree and snuggled by the fire, feeling cozy and content. That night, just as they were about to go to bed, there was a knock at the door. Mark opened it cautiously, expecting a neighbor or someone in need of help. But when he opened the door, no one was there. The snow outside was untouched, and there were no tracks leading away from the cabin. Confused, Mark closed the door, but the feeling of unease lingered. An hour later, another knock echoed through the quiet cabin. This time, Mark and Elise both heard it. This time, they saw something. Just beyond the frosted window, a shadowy figure stood in the distance, its face obscured by the snowstorm. Mark's instinct was to lock the door and ignore it, but Elise urged him to investigate. As they stepped outside, the figure was gone. There was nothing but the endless snow. But as they turned to go back inside, they noticed a strange presence in the yard. An old, weathered sled, its surface covered in layers of snow. They didn't remember seeing it there before. It was as if it had appeared from nowhere. Maybe someone is playing a prank, Aliza suggested, trying to brush off the discomfort. But the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing hour. Lily, normally a brave and cheerful child, had been acting strangely. She kept staring out the window, her face pale and wide-eyed. "Mommy," she whispered, "the man in the snow is watching me." Mark and Elise tried to reassure her, but the unease was palpable. The storm raged outside, cutting off any chance of escape. They gathered around the fire, trying to distract themselves with Christmas music and warm drinks. But the knock came again, this time louder and more persistent. Mark opened the door and stepped out into the snow once more. His breath fogged in the cold, and his heart raced. There, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was a man. His face was hidden by a thick hood, and he stood motionless. His presence seemed impossibly still, as though he had always been there, waiting. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't speak, but slowly lifted a hand, pointing towards the cabin. Mark turned to look back, and that's when he saw it. On the doorstep, in the deep snow, a set of footprints leading away. They were familiar, like his own, and they led right into the woods. Suddenly, Lily screamed from inside the cabin, her voice filled with terror. "He's in the house!" Mark turned to rush inside, but the man had disappeared. Panic surged through him. He burst through the door to find Lily standing in the middle of the living room, pointing toward the fireplace. There, just beyond the crackling flames, was an old photograph. One Mark didn't recognize. It was of a family, but the strange part was the man in the photo. He wore the same dark hood as the figure outside. The faces of the family members were obscured, but Mark could tell the photo was decades old. Suddenly a voice echoed through the cabin, hollow and cold. "He is here to take you." The fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The room grew colder, and Elisa shivered as she realized that the figure was not just a random stranger. It was part of something darker, something tied to the house and the forest itself. The knock came again, louder and more urgent. But this time Mark didn't open the door. Instead, he rushed to the phone to call for help, only to find the line was dead. They were completely isolated. As they huddled together, the shadowy figure appeared once more. This time inside the cabin, standing just beyond the doorway to the room. Its presence was suffocating, and the room seemed to close in on them. The Christmas Eve visitor was not just some stranger. It was something far older and much more malevolent. It had come to collect them, to claim their souls, bound by an ancient curse tied to the cabin and the forest around it. The snowstorm raged on, and by the time the morning light broke through the trees, the cabin was silent. The only thing left behind was the old sled in the yard, buried in snow, with a single blood-red ribbon tied to the handle. And the photograph now resting on the mantel, showing a new family, Mark, Alize and Lily, standing together with the figure in the dark hood. The last part of the curse had been fulfilled.